Good evening and a very warm welcome to the STL lecture during this fall term. It is my great pleasure and honor to introduce our speaker, Professor Dorothea Weltecke, who holds the chair of medieval history at Humboldt University in Berlin. A scholar of Semitic and Syriac studies, Professor Weltecke's research focuses on transcultural and transreligious history, religious deviance, religious minorities, social history, and the history of historiography in the Middle East. Since writing a PhD thesis on the Syriac Orthodox Patriarch Michael the Great of the 12th century, she has had a special interest in Syriac Christianity. Among her numerous monographs, many of which have won prestigious awards, I would like to mention her 2024 study entitled The Three Rings: Why Religions Only Emerged in the Middle Ages, which revolutionizes our understanding of the relationship between followers of the Abrahamic religions during the Middle Ages. Contrary to popular belief, Christians, Jews, and Muslims during that period were well aware of their shared religious heritage, and doctrinal tolerance regarding each religion's truth claim was the norm. The sharp boundaries between religions originated therefore not as a result of the doctrinal differences, but in the legal distinctions between believers and unbelievers, and those who were and were not tolerated. Tonight, Dorothea will speak on a related topic in the history of the discipline. The characteristic of the Syrians is a certain mediocracy, Western pioneers on the Syriac studies and their concepts. And before passing the floor to Professor Weltecke, I would like to express my gratitude for the funding provided by the STD Fund for Historical Studies, which made tonight's lecture possible. Please welcome with me, Professor Weltecke.
Thank you so very much for this honor of being invited here and of the honor of being able to speak here today. I'm myself only half an Orientalist, and I'm not a philologist. I specialize in medieval history. Additionally, I'm also interested in the place of European historiography within a broader transcultural space. That things develop this way is inseparably connected to the history of Oriental studies as I experienced it. In this lecture, I wish to recall the now no longer unfamiliar fact how Syriac literature was received by the early European pioneers of Syriac studies. The pioneers established the foundations of scholarly Syriac philology. They wrote the grammars, compiled the literary histories, and ascribed the manuscripts. And at the same time, these particularly influential pioneers made no secret of their contempt of Syriac literature, and not infrequently for its people. Scholars who work with Syriac know this attitude. Members of the tradition know it as well. Now, one might say that's how things were in the past. Let's move on. As we will see, the past is not entirely over yet. And yes, I also recognize their philological erudition and scholarly output. My goal today is rather a reflection on the categories and assumptions that shape historical thought after the figurative period of the 19th and early 20th century. For me, the history of the Syrian Christians, or Arameans and Assyrians, as many of them call themselves today, is a fruitful point of departure for rethinking categories of European historiography within which they typically do not appear at all. What does it mean to study the churches of the Syriac tradition? One example from my personal experience shall illustrate this. In 2023, I joined a multi-religious delegation to Iraq. Our aim was to visit Christian and Yazidi communities and to gain a clearer sense of their present circumstances. In Iraq, we witnessed both the destruction caused by war and the efforts at renewal. We visited a newly found Catholic university, open also to Muslim students, places special emphasis on architecture and the health sciences. The students expressed their wish to serve their country and to avoid provoking envy or conflict with their Muslim neighbors. At the same time, the wounds of recent history were visible everywhere. Traumatized people, damaged buildings, and cities still bearing the marks of violence. This destroyed bell tower in Karakosh was deliberately left lying there so that the attack on the city would not be forgotten. In Mosul, many churches are being restored, like this one, yet the Christians had not yet returned to live there. They do not trust the security situation. We met the Syriac Orthodox Archbishop Nicodemus. Before the ISIS attack, he kept a box of manuscripts in his bedroom, ready to take with him should he ever have to flee. The manuscript he showed us here is not the most ornate luxury codex you might know from medieval cultures. Moreover, it looks worn and fragile. Yet it is one of the most precious items that he saved. The situation of destruction, of flight, of devastation is something that has deeply shaped the cultural life and the cultural heritage of the Syriac Christians. In other words, in the churches of the Syriac tradition, manuscripts are refugees, just as people are, as Ephraim Ishaq, a specialist in Syriac liturgy and manuscripts, recently said at a conference. Two of my fellow students had also been such witnesses of displacement. Both had fled persecution in the 1980s. Both received political asylum in Germany. In Berlin, they were studying classical Syriac, Semitistics, and ancient Near Eastern history. They were entrusted by their friends and families with the task of preserving their heritage for future generations. We must keep these backgrounds in mind. At the same time, it's not my task to narrate lachrymose Christian history. And it's also not my task to tell their history on their behalf. They write their own histories and are not dependent on Western scholars. Rather, I'm interested in their challenges on the academic historical models in Europe, in which, to say it once more, Syrians do not usually appear. I come to my main chapter then, the pioneers of Syriac studies and their legacies. We now turn to the middle of the 19th century. The period from the second half of the 19th century to the end of the First World War was often described as the true beginning of modern Syriac studies. A decisive turning point came on the 11th November 1847, when a substantial collection of Syriac manuscripts arrived in London. Overnight, the British Museum became the owner of a corpus previously unknown to scholarship. Other emerging nation-states, including Germany with its new capital Berlin, were equally eager to acquire prestigious collections. Syriac manuscripts also were expected to enhance imperial libraries and museums. Torn from their original cultural settings, they became objects of imperial expectation and were bound to disappoint. In the 9th edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, William Wright provided a broad survey of Syriac literature. Theodor Nöldeke contributed the entry on the Syriac language. Together, they offered the first accessible synthesis for a wider public. Wright opened his article with a now canonical passage, which usually is only quoted in part, and I would like to present you the full length because it is even more revealing in this way. The characteristic of the Syrians is a certain mediocrity. They shone neither in war, nor in the arts, nor in science. They altogether lacked the poetic fire of the older, we purposely emphasize the word, the older Hebrews and the Arabs. But they were apt enough as pupils of the Greeks. They assimilated and reproduced, adding little or nothing of their own. There was no Al-Farabi, no Ibn Sina, no Ibn Rushd in the cloisters of Edessa, Keneshri, Nisibis. Yet to the Syrians belongs the merit of having passed on the law of ancient Greece to the Arabs, and therefore, as a matter of history, their literature must always possess a certain amount of interest in the eyes of the modern student. The Syrian church never produced men who rose to the level of a Eusebius, Gregory Nazianzen, a Basil, a Chrysostom. But we may still be thankful to the plodding diligence with which has preserved for us in fairly good translations many valuable works of Greek fathers, which would otherwise have been lost. And even Syria's humble chroniclers, such as John of Ephesus, Dionysius of Thermae, and Baribreus, deserve their meed of praise, seeing that, without their guidance, we should have known far less than we know now about the history of two important branches of the Eastern Church, besides losing much interesting information as to the political events of the periods with which their annals are occupied. Quote, the narrative of the Syrians who only transmitted and translated, but who are to be thanked for that, was here to stay. Period. The mediocre Syrians of Wright is placed within a civilizational hierarchy determined by military, artistic, and scientific achievement. Where Oriental scholarship became a form of imperial knowledge, cultures that lacked such attributes were scarcely recognized on their own terms. Ruben Duval, a French pioneer of the discipline, shared this outlook. His influential Histoire de la littérature syriaque opened with a similar downgrading. Syriac literature, he claimed, was exclusively religious, consistent in his view with the Semitic character, quote, it lacks, as he put it, quote, the lofty flights of lyricism and the fresh and captivating charm of heroic epic. Syriac literature appeared to Duval verbose, didactic, and aesthetically undeveloped. And these charges quickly migrated into linguistic assessments of the Syriac language itself. These three men, among others, shaped the public reception of Syriac literature and culture for the interested public in imperial Europe. They belonged to the dominant generation of desk and library scholars who had academic power, decided about the topics, the criteria, and the methods of academic research. William Wright, Theodor Nöldeke. Theodor Nöldeke was one of the first named students of Syriac met in Germany until the 1980s. I think it's still the case. When he studied Syriac, it did not take long to come across his contempt for Syriac literature. My fellow Syriac students were well aware of that when I asked them in horror. They shrugged their shoulders. They had their own opinion of Western scholars. In Nöldeke's days, his contemporaries explained his aversion to Syriac literature with a tension between his Enlightenment rationalism and the emotional, morally, quote, corrupt culture he believed he was studying. Today, this attitude is described by historians of science as a mixture of Kulturprotestantismus and Eurocentric arrogance. Nöldeke's essay on the Syriac ascetics is telling in this respect. Quote, all in all, we can only regard this phenomenon as pathological. The mania for self-mortification spread among the Syrians like a contagious disease and led the spirit of this people in a false direction. The only public justification he ever gave for devoting so much labor to Syriac, after all, was the awareness that the field still offered immense opportunities for pioneering work. Nöldeke is correctly remembered for strictly rejecting biological racialist doctrines. He also repeatedly spoke out against anti-Semitism, and at the same time, responding to criticism of Ernest Renan's negative assessment of the so-called Semites, Nöldeke broadly defended Renan's reasoning. The spirit of the Indo-Germans, he argued, was superior to that of the Semites even in religious matters. The latter's crudity and fanaticism were already visible in ancient human sacrifice. They showed some inclination towards state building, but always in despotic forms. The Semite was not a good soldier, unwilling to submit to discipline. Nor was he suited to scholarship, lacking the capacity for overview, marked instead by excessive feeling and a nervously unsettled emotionality. Within the racialist dynamics of the 19th century, then, Nöldeke was not of a progressive, but rather of a conservative mindset. He did not go with the latest ideas. His political ideas were also conservative. He opposed universal suffrage, for example, on the grounds of ignorance by the populace. Recent editions of his extensive correspondence kept in Tübingen and Berlin by Bernd Meyer and others have facilitated scholarly inquiry into his person. My personal ambition for today's presentation had been to examine his letters in order to better understand the sources of this aversion against Syriac literature. At the outset of his career, while presenting his Kurzgefasste syrische Grammatik, accompanied by a letter in 1867 to Paul de Lagarde, then professor in Göttingen, he complained of the tedium of Syriac reading. He didn't like Paul de Lagarde for his radical positions, but he considered him to be very important, as he stated in a letter to his friend, the Arabist Michael de Goeje. This letter was also accompanied by his grammar, and here again, he voiced the same frustration with Syriac literature of which he had to read so much lately. His devotion to Greece, a hallmark of his generation, shaped his self-understanding. As he put it 30 years later, again in a letter to de Goeje, I regret again and again that I directed my studies toward the Orient, which is in truth so little congenial to me, instead of toward Greece. His attitude never changed. 99, he wrote to Eduard Meyer, an eminent historian of the ancient world, that he felt, quote, condemned to plague myself with all sorts of small questions of the Semitic languages, and yet I feel myself a Hellene, not a barbarian. All in all, however, Nöldeke's letters so far are somewhat disappointing for the purpose I was reading them. The reason, one finds only very few references to Syriac and Syriac literature at all. Nöldeke talks about the entire world of languages and cultures. He is learned, he is interested, he is generous, his letters are pleasant to read, but only very rarely does he talk about Syriac. Nöldeke's letters thus don't change the impression of his published works, and I feel they don't add any new points to the observations published so far. However, the conclusion of his remarks is clear. Nöldeke had not the first idea of the internal logic of Syriac literature. And from an early point in his life, he never attempted to revise his attitude. Nöldeke never understood the social function and the social setting of this literature. He is not to blame for that. You cannot simply escape your perceived reality. And that is why Nöldeke never realized in his unbroken certainty of European superiority that it was his shortcoming, not the shortcoming of the works he studied. Various attempts have been made by researchers to connect this attitude with Orientalism and with Edward Said, including by myself. While the colonial, imperialistic, and sometimes racist attitudes of the pioneers are obvious, the concept of Orientalism is another matter. Eastern Christians have no function within this theory, nor with the entire modern historical construct of the seemingly Muslim Orient in contrast to the seemingly Christian West, again reinforced by Samuel Huntington and others. Nöldeke and Wright explicitly, and Duval implicitly, referred back to the scholar Ernest Renan, already mentioned. In Renan's system, Syriac literature occupied an especially unfavorable position because it lacked some of the very traits normally attributed to Orientals in the 19th century. Traits which, in European Orientalism, produced both their exotic appeal and their presumed inferiority. In other words, for the pioneers of Syriac studies, they were not Oriental enough. At the same time, the admiration of Nöldeke and others for the Greeks never extended to the medieval Greek. Nöldeke and his friends admired the cultures of the ancients, the Greeks, the ancient Romans, the ancient Near Eastern empires, the Assyrians, Babylon, and Persia. We find the same disparaging remarks about Byzantine or medieval Latin literature in this time, again from the very pioneers who discovered and edited the sources. Both medieval Greek or Latin historiography were dismissively described as monks' chronicles, for example, tedious, religious, irrational. Apart from romantic or nationalistic medievalists, respectively, also the European medieval world held no attraction for many scholars of literature and philosophy in the later 19th century. As we have learned from Jeffrey Cohen and Catherine Biddick, Orientalism and medievalism are in fact twins, concepts produced by modern Europe as the basis for its self-fashioning as hegemonial power of the world. Sorry, I always skip over this one. For my historical approach, this sibling relationship between medievalism and Orientalism is central. Both the medieval and the so-called Oriental worlds were constructed with attributes of timelessness and irrationality as religious tyrannies. Simultaneously, they turned them into sites of longing for a presumed authenticity. Both constructs barbarize these cultures. The dark Middle Ages are likewise imaged as populated by dirty, uncivilized people who stoically accept the fate prescribed to them by the Church. During the age of restoration and censorship in the second half of the 19th century, intellectuals interpreted all the intellectual narrowness they experienced as medieval. Syriac literature then did not fulfill Orientalist yearnings, and neither did it meet European romantic or nationalist needs of belonging. Accordingly, there was no place for it. As research has shown, much of the polemical edge in the statements made by the pioneering generation derived from the difficult relationship between Oriental studies and theology in the 19th century. Scholars like Renan, de Lagarde, Wright, Duval, and Nöldeke experienced complex tensions towards their respective home churches. These constellations intensified their profound dismissal of Syriac literature as religious. In the 16th and 17th century, the outlook had been somewhat different, as is well known. Remarkably, such ideas penetrated even the most remote regions of the Holy Roman Empire. Telling example comes from the tiny county of Waldeck, the smallest in the empire. It happens to be my own home country. So I proudly present its modest castle above a settlement of barely 40 families at that time, but a town with a wall and all in its own right. The grave of the town pastor and court preacher Heinrich Kölner bears witness to this tradition. His epitaph praises him as learned in the liberal arts, grounded in Holy Scripture, and knowledgeable in Greek, Hebrew, and Syriac. The inscription goes on to trace his pastoral service in the today, by some considered rather culturally backwater villages of Adorf, Gottelsheim, the town of Wildungen, and finally the Waldeck court. Kölner could have studied at the universities of Erfurt or Jena, then centers of humanist biblical languages. Syriac in this environment was not the subject of civilizational ranking. It was valued for its proximity to scripture and its connection to the earliest Christian communities and their theological tradition, as is known. And this church-friendly, liturgically interested research tradition did not disappear in the 19th century. There were European scholars, both within secular Oriental studies and within theological scholarship, who respected and valued the Syriac language and who devoted themselves to the study of manuscripts, the preparation of editions, and to the compilation of dictionaries. It is for a reason that I do not want to pick one of the professors as an example, but name an independent researcher, Jessie Payne Margulies, who collaborated with her father, Robert Payne Smith, in Oxford for the Thesaurus of the Syriac language and compiled a concise dictionary herself, a dictionary we all know and still use. The research on German and European Orientalism has shown there certainly was not only one discourse. I also should not forget the theologians, for example, who voiced their contempt for the Syrians not for cultural mediocrity, but for denominational or dogmatic reasons. Still, they contributed to the study with editions and studies. Western Syriac studies is built on the base of different strands. But there are legacies of disregard and legacies of the imperial paradigm that are felt to this day. One of the enduring legacies of this paradigm is a bad impression Western scholars, both the theorists and the traveling Orientalists, left on Syriac Christians. The contempt of the theorists was met by the arrogance of the travelers, who considered themselves to be entitled to bring the manuscripts to the West because the guardians of the tradition were not equipped doing so. Until today, therefore, monasteries often look at Western scholars with great suspicion. The later patriarch of the Syriac Orthodox Church, Ignatius Ephraim Barsaum, traveled to the West early in the 20th century, both to seek intellectual exchange and support, and he also wanted to study the manuscripts of his own cultural heritage that had been relocated to European libraries. He was acutely aware of the disdain expressed by the scholars across various disciplines. As he remarked, it is no self-praise when we say that in our 40 years of intensive and critical study of the writings accessible to us, it was additionally to our advantage that we mastered our language. This made some of the connections between events comprehensible to us before we even studied the opinions of the Orientalists. The Syriac Christians felt the full brunt of disregard during the genocide of 1915 and afterwards. Metropolitan and later Patriarch Barsaum did everything he could through international diplomacy, letters to the British Prime Minister, attendance at conferences, in vain. The perpetrators were never held accountable, the losses were never compensated. It is far from my intention to make Nöldeke or other German Orientalists responsible for the Saifor, as the genocide is called in Aramaic. Rather, the way German military officers dealt with the situation under Turkish command during the war in Asia Minor, as well as the efforts made in the German Empire to downplay news from the East so as not to endanger the military alliance with the Ottomans, these were symptoms of a general disregard. The missionary Johannes Lepsius wrote his report on the situation of the Armenian people during World War I. Other missionaries, nurses, the occasional officer like Armin Wegner wrote letters, documented what they saw or tried to help. The late Martin Tamke published material from the Hermannsburg archives shedding light on these activities. During World War I, young European Orientalists such as Karl Becker and Snook Horgonje were bitterly divided along nationalistic lines. The question that divided them was whether the German Empire should, or in fact did, support the Ottoman propaganda for a jihad against Western colonial powers. In this controversy, Nöldeke tried to mediate between them and wrote letters to this effect. But, and please correct me if I'm mistaken, so far I have not seen a similar controversy between chaired professors in Germany and other European countries regarding the plight of the Syrian Christians or their not being heard in the negotiations for the peace treaty in Lausanne in the year 1922. Patriarch Barsaum testifies to the profound sense of betrayal felt by the affected communities who saw themselves written out of political consideration after having been looked down upon by scholars. Patriarch Barsaum's History of the Syriac Science and Literature, published for the first time in 1943 and and reprinted several times, represents a counter-history. In the first chapter, he offers his refutation of the verdict of the Western scholars, including William Wright's quotation. He does it much more comprehensively than I could do today. It is therefore a very good starting point for those who are interested in this matter. There was no broad reception of Barsaum's book, however, either within the field or in the wider academic public because of the language barrier. Apparently, no one saw the need to translate it until people from the communities themselves took on the task. Matti Musa produced an English version, and Aramaicists, a subdeacon and electrical engineer, being himself born to genocide orphans, produced a German version. With Aramaicists, we reach the era of the first institution of Syriac Orthodox communities in Germany and elsewhere after their emigration in the 60s and 70s. Legacies of disregard were acutely felt during my students' days in the 80s, as I already stated. Yet, Syriac studies are still alive in Europe, even though the institutional conditions are fragile. Most academic scholars work within the frameworks of Oriental studies and theological disciplines, including members from the traditions themselves. The young scholars from all over the world repeatedly expressed indignation at the derisive comments made by the pioneers, just as I did 25 years ago. I have found up to 10 contributions from the last 15 years alone that cite Wright's sentences, cited by outraged young scholars who begin their research by first dismantling earlier judgments. The fact that so much still is not edited or studied is itself a legacy of disregard. There's no time to name all the scholars involved. I rather refer to the numerous new handbooks and the conference proceedings from the United States, Europe, and Asia. And I also would like to refer interested readers to the digital journals, databases, and text recognition projects that have integrated Syriac studies into the cutting edge of digital humanities, largely thanks to George Kiraz. Still, the old topi live on. They also live on because basic principles of source criticism have often been neglected, as Patriarch Barsaum had already emphasized. Remains and sources must, for example, be examined closely with regard to the opportunities and risks of their transmission. What survived only by chance? Which sources were at the greatest risk of being lost? As Patriarch Barsaum told his communities and all the world, the loss of cultural heritage, encompassing secular written works, artworks, architecture, charters, luxury objects, and more, has been immense. Numerous medieval sources already attest to the confiscation of learned libraries, like the one by the scholar Jakub Bartelle in the 13th century. Therefore, the surviving evidence is not representative for the cultures from which it originates. This is true to a far greater extent than for many other medieval cultures in Afro-Eurasia, with the exception of the Jewish medieval cultures. Religious writings, liturgy, and scripture constituted essential components of communal life and identity. Therefore, these books were hidden beneath the church doors, concealed within the walls. They were safeguarded in the corners of village houses and transported to safety on donkeys' backs, as oral witnesses account. Eduard Sachau, the manuscript collector of the Wilhelmine Empire, stated that peasants keeping manuscripts in their cellars they could not even read was a sorry sign of cultural decline. I must freely admit that in my home village in Waldeck, surely farmers were not hiding manuscripts at any given time. Sachau did not grasp neither the iron will nor the specific culture of resilience that had learned to protect the culture together with the most important books. It resulted in a bottleneck for the transmission. The sacred book for usage in the community were privileged, where much of the remainder had to be left behind. While the growing library of edited books today disproves the mediocrity topos, scholars have asked time and again with genuine interest whether any advanced scientific work was written in the Syriac in the 12th or 13th century beyond what is preserved in the transmitted sources. Here again, basic research is needed on the social conditions that made the production of scholarly texts possible in the first place. Syriac physicians continued to be respected practitioners at the Mongol courts down to China in the 13th century. Syriac, at that time, would not, however, be the first choice for writing now, as Christians would share the scientific Arabic of their time. What is more, the opportunities for producing texts were simply not existent. They were largely excluded from patronage, hospitals, endowed academic chairs, observatories, and courtly protection. Yet, structures like these were and are essential. It is not talent and hard work alone that makes achievements, a fact that members of dominant cultures often tend to overlook. Just to mention one example, in the 13th century, the monk John Barsaum was what I would call a teacher of liberal arts in the monastery of Marsabrisho, close to Erbil. Barsaum tried to run a school as best he could to foster philosophical learning. In Erbil, Muzaffar ad-Din Kökburi ruled, a significant military leader and later the son-in-law of Saladin. He sponsored public buildings and social institutions in the area of the lower town in Erbil that he established. He also was an active patron of the arts. Among other things, he founded a madrasa and a ribat. His vizier Ibn al-Mustawfi wrote a comprehensive history of Erbil. Erbil's historical tradition, in which Christian churches had once played a role, got a new narrative. Colophones describe how Barsaum discussed questions of ecclesiastical chronology at the very time. He wrote letters in search of the chronicle of Eusebius, which was not available in his library. He said, in other words, he lacked the basic material and the conditions to write history. It is obvious that he thought it to be vital to study church history and maybe provide a counter-history. Whether Barsaum was successful in his quest, we do not know. The monastery and its library have almost entirely been consigned to oblivion. New methods of heuristics are needed to pursue these complex constellations, to find new ways to circumvent the dire scarcity of sources from everyday life. We don't even have an overview where medieval communities existed and which multi-religious constellations they lived. With the Damascus project, we attempted to compile data and visualize this presence of urban communities within their multi-religious settings. Securing funding for a continuation of this project is another matter, because one constantly has to explain what these cultures are and why they matter. Many here will be familiar with this experience. In the European countries in which Eastern Christians now live, we currently have a minister, for example, of a Syrian background. They do not appear in the general historical narrative. Students of history and future school teachers never encounter their history because it is considered the domain of other academic disciplines. This is also why the Saifo remains largely absent from mainstream historical scholarship. We have not even begun to understand the common imperial history we share in Germany, the history of the German Empire and the late Ottoman Empire as our common but divided history of Germans, Turks, or Eastern Christians. For many in the diaspora, the ISIS attacks of 2015 were therefore experienced as a repetition of this long-standing pattern. I conclude. What I wanted to show you today is that the contempt of the early pioneers is not just some regrettable incident of the past. It is still part of our present and has been as such for 100 years. I also hoped to have shown you the lasting impact of the imperial paradigm. At the same time, when empires seem on the rise, we might want to remember with Syriac Christians or Jewish chroniclers, to come to think of it, that empires tend to end one day, albeit leaving more often than not ruins, economical and ecological devastation. In historiography, we already have alternatives to this historical imperial model. The Syriac chronicles of Michael the Syrian and the Maphrian, the Primas by Brunel of the 12th and 13th century demonstrate different historical models beside the imperial models. For example, these models are polyphonic, polycentric, and interconnected. They do not only focus solely on hegemonic powers. These chroniclers found a systematic place for the groups without secular power as part of the cultural history of the world, nonetheless. Medieval history today provides us with a different perspective on the shared world in Afro-Eurasia. There are already historical models in which post-imperial Europe is not in the center. Latin Christianity is but one among others, and before the European hegemony, it was not the most influential one. In this world, Muslim cultures in the West and Christian cultures in the East, together with Jewish networks, formed a new, innovative, and complicated landscape that is the base for our common history. Regardless whether you are interested in Syriac studies or not, that is what we all can learn from the Syriac cultures. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this fascinating and eye-opening lecture. And Professor Weltecke has kindly agreed to have a short Q&A session. So if anyone has comments or questions, you're invited to have them now. Yes, Yuri.
Thank you very much for your presentation. And you have shown a very impressive gallery of Western scholars who dismissed Syriac studies until Patriarch Barsaum. So my simple question would be, do you find any examples of counter voices and other opinions who spoke against this trend? And before coming of Patriarch Barsaum suggested the value of Syriac literature?
No.
It was a common discourse shared by everyone.
The content or the topos that they translated and didn't add anything new, I think that was shared by quite a few people. And then there is, of course, people who are interested in the history of theology. They are interested in the liturgy. They are interested in Ephraim. They edit these texts and they value these texts. So, but they wouldn't found a counter narrative to that. So there are different discourses at the same time, I think. The theological discourse, which could be polemical at times, and then the ones who really like these, the poems, Ephraim, Jacob of Syriac, and these texts and editing. But for the entire culture, there is no counter narrative.
I think I was going to say, just as an example of like this, the changing fortunes or views of Syriac, like someone like Francis Burkitt had very negative things to say about Ephraim. He said Ephraim's a windbag. He just repeats himself. He's a terrible poet. And then I think Edmund Beck, a German Benedictine, he edited Ephraim's poems in the mid 20th century. He devoted his life to that and made new additions. And so he sort of lays an egg that someone like Robert Murray and then Sebastian Brock hatch. And so beginning in the 1970s, Ephraim was rehabilitated in the views of a lot of Western scholars. And he goes from being sort of a windbag and very prolix to being the greatest poet after Dante in the Christian tradition.
Yeah.
That's sort of like, that's an example of a shifting fortunes of Syriac.
And in the 70s, things really started to change from what I see in the Netherlands with the scholars in Groningen and in Leiden, who really started a completely new tradition of studying Syriac and shaped a new strand, could say. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I just have a question for clarification. When you're saying Syrians, I think it's a bit broad definition, and sometimes it was not really clear for me. And I would like to learn or to know more, if you can elaborate more. Was it the same attitude toward, for example, after the split between the Catholicism and the Orthodoxy? I mean, the Catholic Syrian Church, was it the same attitude to them and their manuscripts and this community, or to the Chaldean, or maybe the ancient East Church of the East, I think, also in Iraq, given the fact that there's also different dialects, I bet, traditions?
Yes, we could try to differentiate between these different strands, and there is also something that I could not go into. There are still collaborations going on. We could ask ourselves how fair these kind of collaborations have been. And there is still, with some people, there is the dogmatical difference is very important. But for example, Nöldeke is scolding Bickel for making theological dogmas being important, because that's not the point. So if you're reading as a Protestant or a Catholic, Syriac Orthodox or Chaldean or Church of the East, then you should be free of these. So within that, you see there are different positions on how to work this. In general, when I talk about Syrian Christians, I try to mean all the Christians of the Syrian traditions in the plural, and be aware that we have quite a few of them within that fold. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. It's really an interesting example of a sort of methodological issue that we should like what we study, right? I mean,
No, it's not necessary.
Right? There was the kind of shows that, but the question I wanted to ask is a different one. not so much about the epistemology there, but about the target of the contempt, because it seems to be not the Syrians, right? But I mean, if one looks at the Nöldeke letters specifically, I think there was a lot of contempt for religion in some kind of general sense. He has this recurring anecdote of finding out at 12 years old that the Eucharist is about cannibalism, and then this turning him off Christianity altogether, that sort of stuff. And there is this really very aggressive anti-religious discourse going on that is also responsible. I mean, they're often very funny, these letters, when it comes to that. I'm wondering, what is this? What's the relation maybe between this typical preoccupation of scholarship with itself and with the object of study, and how they maybe fail to sort that out, and that maybe also has to do with this issue of liking and not liking. But just to know what your thoughts on this are.
Yeah, could you repeat the question, please?
Could I
Yeah,
repeat it? Yeah. So I was wondering about the anti-religious polemic in the Nöldeke letters, which is sort of discourse that is also directing the contempt against, in a sense, religion in Germany in his time. So he is pretty disgusted with Christianity altogether, and I think some of that might feed into this contempt for the Syrians, right? And that raises, I think, interesting questions about how much the scholarship is concerned with itself, and how much it is concerned with the other that it studies. And there is a sort of contamination going on there, which also has to do with this issue that I mentioned at the beginning of liking what you study, right? Because if you like it, you have to sort of first sort out what is other and what is yourself in this, right? So that's
but that's fairly well known that these Orientalists coming out of theology or wanting to have independence from theology, they had a very special relation to their home churches and to belief in general. That was one strand. And the other one was this Kulturprotestantismus, who had just absolutely no clue what was going on in anything that wasn't this kind of rationalistic kind of faith they thought would be the future, if they thought it all. But many of them, and that has been shown in research, is that there were atheists among them. There were really violent atheists among them, and they had these institutional problems with that we find also in conflicts today between religious studies and theology, and problems of faculty and being part of an institution and being accepted into an institution. So that's interesting, and it's also interesting to see how then each and every one is dealing with his own belief. And I think that is something that is extremely interesting for the late 19th century in general, because things are shifting so much, as we have also seen in the conference today with these Jewish Orientalists who are redefining things for themselves. So this kind of things are going on here as well. Concerning liking your subjects, I'm not so sure. I'm studying religious violence, and I've never been a fan of religious violence. And then there's this, I think it was Umberto Eco, who also said you can study frogs without being a frog. And so that's, maybe it's not necessary. But if I'm not part of it, and if it is strange to me, like for Nöldeke, then maybe I could say, I don't understand, I have no clue what's wrong. And that would be maybe helping.
Well, thank you very much. I think this was a great final statement, and thank you very much again.